All right, welcome back to the Backroom show, where two writers spend a lot of time in the back room and nobody asks any questions.
Yeah, very true. Now it's my office, so now it's even. I spend more time back here now.
Yes, that's right. In fact, it's pretty interesting. We talked last time about the back room and what it is, and it's kind of transforming into something else now, which we kind of talked about, right? So you're able to get some work done back here, and very soon we won't be just talking about that transformation, but people will be able to see it because we hope to be transitioning into video soon. That's kind of exciting.
That's right.
So,
Before we get started, we should say welcome everyone. I'm Jonathan Graves Wright. With me today is
Jacob Patrick.
Very good. And Jacob's going to take the lead today. He wants to talk about something very specific.
Yeah, so we talked before about how this is not a writing podcast. It's just two writers talking about writing. But we're also sort of documenting our stories. And we'll talk more about why we would want to document that probably in a few minutes. But so today we're sort of talking about how we can improve our business as indie authors, as self-published writers, and sort of taking that from the perspective of personal branding. So what would you say is the difference between branding and marketing, or branding and sales?
Well, when you think about marketing is it's like eye appeal. It's like an instant. You could say it's like an instant movement in the world of business or retail. So we market because we want to sell things. We market because we want to move things. And we market because those things might be accumulating in a warehouse, or it might be an idea that we want to get off the ground. So we market those things very quickly. Branding, totally different. Branding is building with a foundation. So you have a foundation, and then you slowly build that little empire, or you build that business around a brand, whatever that brand might be.
Yeah. I think that branding stays in people's minds longer because you're building an identity, you're building a reputation. So when we talk about personal branding, which is what we're talking about now, because neither of us are CEOs of a big company and we don't have any desire to be. Yeah. We're just individuals. But we want to build a personal brand around ourselves as authors or as artists, as perhaps speakers, podcasters, etc. Building that personal brand, it may take longer to establish, but once it is established, it's much more valuable than throwing dollars behind advertising, which we might also be doing. But we know that that's a short-term solution. But what we're doing here just in this podcast, for example, is part of our building a personal brand. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and if you think, like, just for an example, so give a shout out to, let's say, a company like Kellogg's or Kraft, something like that. When you think about the brand, what comes to mind when you think about the brand? You think about the millions of products they have.
Yeah.
So one product can sell much, much better than maybe another product that they have. But that's not the point. The point is that the brand is what attracts people to buy any one of those different products. And so as Kellogg's or Kraft built a brand, they could produce anything they wanted and people would still buy it because of the brand, not because of the product.
Yeah, it's true. The brand can be something very powerful.
Yeah.
So I recently read a book by a guy named Patrick Hanlon. It's called Primal Branding. And so he sort of analyzes, he's been a branding consultant for many, many years. He's worked consulting very large companies, and he's in his years of studying this, he's kind of worked up these 7 steps or 7 aspects of the perfect brand. A brand that will build a tribe of followers, or what he calls zealots, that will follow that brand. So I wanted to go through those 7 steps, and maybe we can talk about how, because his book, his information is mostly focused on large companies. He talks about movements like charities. He talks about social change. He talks about places like Disneyland has a specific brand, and how that was manufactured. He does talk about public personalities like Oprah or famous singers and musicians, but something for artists. He doesn't specifically talk about that in the book, but I think a lot of those concepts can still apply. So I'm going to go through each of these 7, and then we can kind of just talk about how we feel about them. So here's the first one. The first one is creation story or origin story. So he says, all beacon brands have an origin story about how they got here. Every person, place, or thing was started somewhere, by someone, somehow. Where are you from? Apple started in a garage. So did HP. Facebook started in a dorm room. eBay started in a bedroom office. The inspiration for Velcro was the thistle. Rome was started by 2 twins. It's not just about history, it's about legacy. Yeah. So that's the first point. A creation story or an origin story. So he talks a lot in the book about how brands should really put a lot of effort into telling that story, creating that narrative and getting that out to people. But what about you and me as creators, as authors, as artists? How important, or not how important, but how do you think we could tell our creation story or origin story?
Well, here's what I learned in business was this, that every single person, every single item, you have to build a story around it. Mm-hmm. If there's no story, there's no connection. So as writers, people have to understand that you just don't drop into the back room and write a story.
The Backroom show.
You don't just drop into the Backroom show and write a story. You and I are writers because of experience, background, or our life story. So somewhere in there, our story began. And so to build a brand, you literally need to connect with people. They need to understand your story because your story may sound a lot like them. And so building a brand around your story will incite them or move them to read your story.
Yeah.
And that may even help them to start writing their own.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think about that because everybody's story is unique, but it's also familiar. And there's that sort of juxtaposition between unique and familiar that's interesting. And I think it's funny because we're storytellers, right? So I write novels, I tell stories, I write stories for a living. And yet that doesn't mean that I'm automatically good at telling my own story or mining my life for interesting stories to tell. But we all have those interesting stories to tell. We have to find them, and then we have to work on how to tell those stories in an interesting way, in a good way, a way that'll catch on, that'll catch people's attention. And then we have to find ways to slip those stories in. So I was thinking about that, like, you have author's notes. This is something I did in my last 2 novels. Well, my first 2 novels, let's be real, right? My last 2 and first 2 novels. In the author's note, I included a personal story that in some way relates to inspiration for the book, or a way in which my personal story might in some way be similar to something the main character went through in that book. So you finish this book, and at the end, I could have just written like a 1-page, oh, thanks for reading, it's so important to me that you read, blah, 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 that anybody could have written.
Yeah.
But I chose to put, 5, 6, 10 paragraphs of a personal story, a personal event that was exciting or traumatizing or whatever for me. And that was a perfect time to slip that in. You also have bios. So where might you have an author bio online that you could incorporate perhaps a personal story?
Well, I would suggest this, especially if you have a Facebook or an Instagram, that would be a great place to put a bio.
Definitely.
Because you have followers that are going to read, what you write or what you put on Facebook or Instagram. So putting a bio there, great to have that. A bio can be on the back of a book, back page.
Yep, it sure can.
Of your book. And just use them in the best way that you can to let people know who you are.
I think on Amazon, I know I have not done this for myself. And if I haven't done it, I'm pretty sure I haven't shown you how to do it. And that is, you can put a bio for yourself as an author in Amazon.
Right.
And there's like quite a bit of opportunity. Like it's not just three sentences, right? There's quite a bit of opportunity to write something. And I don't know how many author bios I've read that are so forgettable that even like now I couldn't tell you whose bio was whose, because it was just, so and so is from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and he lives with his wife and his dog, and he likes walking on the beach and writing books. Well, that could be anybody, right? What does that even mean? How am I supposed to care about that bio? That sounds like text that was put in there because you were told you have to have a bio.
Exactly.
Right? But what a perfect opportunity. And the same thing on Facebook, same thing on your personal website, in the back of your books. There's so many places that you could put a really personal bio. And there's no rule that says you have to have the same bio in every location.
No, that's right.
What if a hardcore fan learns more about you as a person and feels closer to you because they've taken the time to read your bio on your website, in the back of your latest book, on Amazon, on Facebook, etc., etc., and each one of those has a different personal story in just 10 sentences. I'm not saying you have to write a short story, once upon a time, right?
Yeah.
But something that in some way informs people about who you are and why you got into writing. I think that could be really interesting. And learning to work that in could be really cool.
Well, and the other thing is, too, if you just take, for example, the 4 books of poetry that I've written. Those 4 books did not come from one person at the same age in the same decade.
Yeah.
Those 4 books all came from different periods of my life. Mm-hmm. And so if you were just to read the title of one of my books, The Dark Closet, you might think, okay, I don't really get the title of the book. What's the dark closet? But if there's a little bio attached to that book to tell you my little story behind the dark closet, it might bring that book, that might bring that poetry even like to greater life. Definitely. And you might even be able to connect with it more.
It's a great idea.
It's branding,
Yeah. Do you have that currently in your book?
I do not have that currently in my books.
It'd be a really great idea.
Yeah.
Because it's like a reward. It's a treasure you're giving. It's like a gift.
Yeah.
You're giving the person that not only started reading your book, but got all the way to the end.
Yeah.
Say, in return for you taking time to read my work, I'm going to give you something from me, something very personal.
Yeah.
Not art that I've created that's meant for the masses, but a personal gift to you, which is pretty awesome, really, right?
Absolutely.
I know that some authors really rock the author's note. Stephen King is an example. He really rocks, especially back in the day in like the 80s and 90s, he rocked those author's notes. I haven't read any recent books from him. I don't know if he still does it, but it would be like a personal letter, right? You could just imagine this guy sitting there at the typewriter or writing with a pen, writing this personal letter to you, dear reader, right? And he would sign the author's note, Uncle Stevie.
Yeah.
Which is amazing, right?
Yeah.
Like, look, I'm not Stephen King to you anymore, because you've taken the time to get all the way through my book and you've taken the time to read my personal note. Therefore, we're on a first name basis now, right?
Yeah.
We have a connection and I'm embracing that connection, which is really awesome. I think also most writers or most artists should probably have some other way of getting their voice out there other than their books. And that might be online. Mm-hmm. That might be through a podcast like what we're doing, or, a YouTube show or something. It doesn't have to be about writing. We've tried to stray from that a little bit. we're kind of talking about writing, but not so much. It could be about gardening, could be about anything, right? But it's just a place where you can express yourself personally, and people can become attached to you and get to know you. And what a perfect opportunity to slip in little stories about who you are and where you come from. That's the perfect place to do that, right? So that's something to think about. Include that creation story or origin story in as many places as possible. Now, before I go into the next step, there's something else to think about in the same step about creation story. I've been thinking a lot about it personally, and that is a concept that another guy that talks a lot about branding and marketing online, he talks about, and that is to document, not create, right? Yeah. So I recently read the book Crushing It. That's by Gary Vaynerchuk is his name. And I followed him quite a bit online as well. And this is a concept he includes in the book and also online. The idea of don't create something. For artists, we're like, well, we're creators. Of course we create. Well, that's not what he means. He means when you're online on social media, don't pretend to be somebody else.
Exactly.
Be yourself. And if you're not already in our case, personalizing it, if you're not already a best-selling author, New York Times best-selling author, don't feel the pressure of trying to act like one. Just be you. And if you're just starting out, just be you starting out and be open and honest about that journey, right? So here we are, barely beginning our careers as indie authors, and we barely have anything out. We certainly don't have a lot to show for our efforts so far, and we're already talking about ourselves in this podcast. We're certainly not trying to fake it till we make it.
Yeah.
We're just talking about where we are.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
And really, if you think about it then, right now, you and me, we are documenting our origin story live, which is kind of cool. Right? Like, I think I talked last time about how we are becoming who we're going to be in 5 years or in 10 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And this show is becoming what it's going to be at episode 50. It isn't the same show it's going to be at episode 50, but it's already on the path of becoming that show. We don't see where it's going because we can't see the future, but we can see something being created, which is really cool. So we're documenting that process, which is really exciting. And I don't know if I talked about it on the show or I talked offline with you about how cool would it be to have like Michael Jordan practicing as a kid.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
like what if somebody had a camera on him for hours and hours? What if he had a vlog, which wasn't a thing at the day, right?
Yeah.
What if he had a vlog of Michael Jordan becoming Michael Jordan, right? That would be amazing. People would pay thousands and thousands of dollars to own that DVD set or to watch it on, Amazon or Netflix or whatever, or go to the movies and watch a documentary about him becoming him. But nobody can go back in time now and record that and document that,
exactly.
Right? So all they can do is interview people. And I'm sure there's been documentaries made about Michael Jordan or whoever. If not, then there will be one day. There's about everybody these days, right?
Yeah.
But we don't have to wait until we're already somebody, whatever that means, right? And then come back and say interviews. Well, I remember when I published my first book. Well, here we are now.
Yeah, we're on the first square of the game of life.
That's right.
That's it.
That's right. That's it. Which is kind of cool. So we're creating an origin story, a creation story here by documenting from the beginning.
Absolutely.
And then you combine that with telling personal stories about your past, and you have what, that first step is, a creation story. You have that in the whole. And really, because the word story is in that step, you could guess that as writers, that should be one of the easiest things in this list for us, right? Like, we should have the creation story nailed, right?
Yeah.
You might have Facebook or whatever, these other companies, they may have to struggle and work in order to create a narrative, a creation story. This should be easy for us. Yeah. All right, let's look at a second one. The second one is creed. It says every brand has core values and beliefs, a reason for being. Think different. Just do it. Semper Fi. When we establish our values and what we live for, we attract others who share those values. Justice for all. postmodernism, what do we come to work? Why do we come to work in the morning? So I think that's pretty interesting. What do you think about how do you think that could apply to an author or an indie artist these days? Having a creed or a core motto.
Well, I think for you and I, this is going to be a little bit different. Like the podcast is one thing because you and I love to talk about writing. We love to discuss our adventures. We love to talk about our inspiration. But when it comes to the inner creed that a lot of us, live by, I've always lived by the kind of the inner core that if I'm not having fun, I don't want to do it anymore. And I don't know if that really applies to my writing, but when you think about when I think about my inner self, my inner struggles, why I began to write poetry, you have or develop this creed of survival. In my case, that was kind of the idea, right? So through my writings, I'm trying to connect with people who are trying to survive every day, every minute of the day, whatever that might be. So I try to write from that core. And then along the same lines, I also find that if I don't enjoy something, I don't do it for very long. I have to love things that I'm doing. So you can't force yourself to be someone that you're not. If it's not part of you, it's not going to develop. So it's thinking about, really who you are, and just what you wish to develop.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's true. And that's going to be different for everybody, right?
Is.
Every author is going to have a different creed. Mm-hmm. And I chewed on this for a long time, and I'm still not fully satisfied that I've come up with what my creed would be, whatever that might be, however that might apply to an author, right? And it also has a lot to do with the fact that neither of us is really sure where else this is going to go, right? So one thing that, like for me personally, I really love and I would like to incorporate into my personal brand is public speaking. Right. And I'd love to get paid to be a speaker. And even if I don't get paid, I'd love to be invited to be a speaker and to talk to crowds of people, because it's something that we both have, because of the volunteer work we do. Other than this, we have a lot of experience with anyway, and we're constantly getting more experience with it. So we have probably easily double the hours in front of crowds than most people on LinkedIn today branding themselves as a public speaker.
Oh, even CEOs.
Right. So yeah. It seems to me as a no-brainer for me personally, something I would like to try to incorporate. And I just don't know how to make one personal brand, one unified personal brand to build around that. So I'm still chewing on it. The best thing I can think of is, as a personal speaker, what I am usually most interested in talking about is telling a story in some way, where a story is sort of the core that lessons might be built on or hung on. It's like the wall that the shells are hung on. It's the core that the lessons are built on is some kind of story, whether that's a personal experience story or a story from somebody else. So perhaps being a storyteller is a way to unify public speaking. And then, I've also written a handful or a dozen novels, right? And it might be a way to sort of unify that. Mm-hmm. I haven't quite worked it out, but something revolving around a storyteller may end up being sort of the creed, right? I can understand how a nonfiction author, this would be a lot easier because you're helping people do something. And all of your books, of course, your books aren't just repeats one after another of the same thing, the same topic necessarily, but they're all helping people in a certain field, in a certain area, or people from different fields trying to do the same thing, whether that's to be healthier, to be happier, to find more success in XYZ aspect of their life. And so a nonfiction author, this would be a lot easier to do, to come up with that central creed. The other option, which we talked a little bit about for you, is not dissecting, but bisecting the two aspects of what you publish. You have fiction and poetry on one side, and nonfiction, self-help or business books or whatever on the other side. And while you're obviously still the same person, you recognize there's going to be very little overlap between those two things. You could literally have two creeds.
Yes.
You could have two sides, be bipolar, so to speak. On one side, this is your creed. On the other side, this is your creed. So that could be another option for authors, right?
Yeah, and I think if you're dividing or segueing, no, not segueing. When you're
segregating or dividing,
that's the word I'm looking for. When you're segregating genres, because poetry is at one end of the scale, and the consulting that I want to do through my books or even online consulting for individuals, that's on the far spectrum of the other side.
Yeah.
So there's no way that I could link those two really together. So I would have to have two different creeds to develop those two genres of what I'm trying to accomplish. Yeah. But the only thing is that as a consultant, you could do public speaking to help, the people that I want to help in business. And you could do public speaking for your poetry if that ever came to that as well. So you could marry those two in that aspect as well. But yeah, they're two distant spectrums of writing.
Yeah, and I can give you an example of what I could see you doing. On one side, you're writing business books because you want to help people. You have a certain background in business. You want to help people. On the other side, you have your poetry, which is 90% of it is kind of focused on surviving depression.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I could actually see you writing not maybe a fiction book, but memoirs of some kind. That's not poetry. It's just you writing memoirs, a series of personal essays that kind of get kind of sewn together to make a memoir, right? And I could see you actually writing some kind of like self-help motivational. I know that sounds just real spammy and
it's the cliche.
Bunch of hurrah, hurrah, and sprinkles and glitter and no real substance.
Yeah,
which they get a bad rap, and I don't know if maybe that's justified to a certain extent, or maybe not. I don't know, but I could see you writing something, and at some point getting invited to speak, not before a group of business people or college graduates or whatever that are at that edge, that side, but before a group of people about how to hold on or how to find the beauty in life even when everything seems to be falling apart, or how to use art or poetry to cope with difficult situations or something like that. I could see you kind of going that direction, and finding some success there, right? But again, that'd be two separate things. Yeah. You may have nonfiction books, but under the two different personas because they don't really match.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah. Well, let's talk about one more.
Okay.
Because we're running long already. Okay, so the third one is icons. So this is like what people think about when they think of branding. Mm-hmm. And if you ask the average person what branding is, this is what they think the whole of branding is. Basically, they think branding means you need a new logo, right? Or a new website.
Yeah.
Right? So this is icons. It says these sensory impressions instantly signal who you are. Not just your brand's logo, but also your product design, think iPhone or smart car, packaging, think Birchbox, Palm, Mrs. Myers, experiences, think Red Bull, Cirque du Soleil, Burning Man, and environments, think Apple Store, the Redwood Forest, or Sephora store. Icons are quick constructions, concentrations of meaning that we instantly identify with and feel something about. Icons can become cultural memes. The hashtag, streaming Smosh, PewDiePie, or Kim Kardashian's figure. Our primal brains are hardwired to know if we should approach or avoid these iconic moments. Think of the last time you entered a store for the first time or downloaded onto a new website. In microseconds, you knew if you wanted to stay or get the heck out. So I think this is really true. He goes in the book in a lot of detail about how stores will focus on the lighting, the colors, the music. Even certain stores and like beauty salons will hire firms to create a certain scent. So when you walk in, every store smells the same.
Exactly the same, yeah.
Right? I get that because that's why I love libraries or a bookstore. I love the sort of the musty, papery smell. And a lot of people who are dedicated readers, they're just in love with that smell because it kind of connects them to a sense of familiarity. I've been here before. You've never been to that bookstore in your life, but you've been there before because that smell is an icon.
Me in coffee shops, yeah.
Coffee shops, same example, right? You instantly feel at home because it's a coffee shop. Maybe it's coffee shop / bakery, so there's even more smells that work really well together, right? Yeah. And you instantly fall into this. Maybe you've never been to that coffee shop in your life, but that smell does something. And the colors of coffee shops, as an example, are usually the same. There's usually very earthy tones, not just because coffee is brown, so the store has to be brown, but because that gives you a certain feeling. And it's a feeling of familiarity. If you already know you like coffee shops, and you walk into a coffee shop and it's bright blue with flashy bright lights, and it's really bright and really sterile smelling like a cafeteria, you're going to be like, this is a coffee shop? And you even question if the coffee's going to be any good based on how it looks, which is insane. One has nothing to do with the other, but that's icons. That's the power of icons. So what about for an author or an artist? How would icons, the way things look, branding and logo and web design and so forth, how would that play into things?
Well, that's more difficult along our line of industry. You and I talked about this when we were writing our little author's notes or our little introductions in our books. The one thing that we did not want to say was, relax with this book in your hand with a glass of wine.
Yes.
That's so blasé.
Yeah, and a lot of people, we researched it, a lot of people are doing that in poetry right now. All the top poems on Amazon, like in contemporary poetry, everyone says, curl up with a glass of wine and read this book, or curl up with a cup of coffee and read this book.
Yeah.
So somebody's copying somebody. There's no way they all came to that idea on their own.
Yeah, exactly. So when I think about how you might develop this logo or you might develop an identification, you and I had this conversation when we were doing the artwork for my books.
Yes.
So if you look at all 4 of my books, there is one leading, you could say, feel or sight line in
yes.
every one of my books, which is?
Well, for one thing, the color gray, right? They all have, with slight variation, almost the identical light color gray to them. So that's one thing we did.
Absolutely.
I believe all 4 books also have the same font.
They do.
I think they all have the same font or a very similar font.
Yeah.
So how does that help, do you think?
Well, not only is it an identification for people who are looking for a certain writer, and that'll be a concept that runs throughout my publications.
Mm-hmm.
But we chose that particular color, first of all, because we are dealing with depression. It's grayscale. It just simply is.
Yeah.
That's what depression all is. It's grayscale. But the other thing that I felt that the grayscale did was that it relaxed you into the title. It kind of relaxed you into the book.
It gives you a certain feel.
It gives you that certain feel.
This is something you're going to take time with and just relax and read.
Exactly.
Right. If you're writing thriller novels, then you would use a bright red or orange or something, or yellow, something catching.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So people that read poetry aren't necessarily, they don't get into poetry and want to read poetry because they are the most excited, exuberant, optimistic people in the world. These are people that really want to connect with their own feelings.
Yeah, there you go.
And so that's why there's no color in my books or on my covers.
Yeah, it's very desaturated.
Absolutely.
Very muted, very gray, very pale. Yeah.
Now, the other thing that I told you about this before I even started writing, but we decided at the end it had to be done. All of my poetry that I've ever written has never had a title. But you'll find in my books that they have a title.
Yeah, just so they're easier to find.
They're easier to find. Yeah. You can map through them a lot easier. The reason I never liked titles on poetry is because titles are leading. They already direct the mind to a thought, right? So if I say, the title of my poetry is The Rainbow Sky, well, immediately your mind goes to a rainbow sky. Without a title, you could read that poem and pretty much come up with whatever you were feeling.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. It's more open.
Yeah, more open. So that's what you basically want to do when you're developing that idea, that feeling, that genre, or that environment, I should say, that around what you're doing.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, where our time is up for today, I do want to talk a little bit more about icons because there's a few other points I think would be interesting. And the point about covers we can come back to. It's a perfect bookmark because we already said a little bit about it. We can talk more about that and talk more about these either in the very next episode, or maybe we'll just leapfrog, do something else, and then come back into this conversation afterwards. It could be fun to kind of vary things up.
Vary it up. Yeah.
So that's great. Anything else we need to say to wrap things up?
I think we can wrap it.
All right. Well, this is Jacob Patrick.
And Jonathan Graves Wright.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye, everybody.